Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello and Happy New Year. You may have noticed we've been publishing a bit less often over the winter months, but we're glad to be back and to share this new episode with you. In it, Judith Hill-Weld talks about how trying to control our emotions can interfere with being present in our lives. She discusses the importance of not postponing joy and describes her passion for working with individuals who have developmental and intellectual disabilities.
Judith Hill-Weld is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a self-compassion-informed therapist, and a mindful self-compassion teacher in training. Her approach to therapy is rooted in psychodynamic concepts as well as acceptance and commitment therapy. In addition to being a psychotherapist and MSc teacher, Judith is a lover of dogs and poems and aspires to be a self-compassionate mess. If you are a fan of Noble Mind, you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter, and join our free Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/NobleMind. You can learn about upcoming events, get our show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. Enjoy the show. Hello, we are here with Judith Hill-Weld. Welcome to Noble Mind. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Why don't we have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Well, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in California, and I've had a private practice here for over 20 years. One of my specialties is working with people whose lives are impacted by developmental and intellectual disability, as well as folks with cognitive impairments in adulthood due to things like traumatic brain injury or various illnesses. I would say another specialty of mine is supporting people through grief and loss, as well as facing chronic and threatening illness and disability. And generally, I would just say I love working with people who are navigating major transitions in their lives and trying to grow a more meaningful way of living.
Beautiful. Maybe we could dive into one of these topics in a little bit more depth. I feel like there's a lot of directions we could go here. But since you mentioned what it sounds like is a variety of different types of disability, maybe you could just talk a little bit about your work in that area some more.
My work in this area is actually accidental. So it was not a plan. In fact, it was not a plan to become a therapist at all. But once I did, I was in training. And somebody noticed on my resume that I had a variety of different experiences working with people with developmental disabilities in volunteer capacity, none of which I had thought of as a thread or really identified as a plan. And in fact, those experiences seemed kind of short-lived to me and like not a central focus of my life. But somebody, my boss, noticed that those things were on my resume and suggested that I take over a contract that we had at the clinic where I was working to provide services to people with developmental disabilities. And I think at the time I was just feeling floundering a little, not knowing what kind of therapist I was going to be or where I was going to land. And I thought, well, I'll try this. And if it doesn't work, then I'll see how it goes. And I met my first client, an adult with an intellectual disability and a mental illness. And I loved it from the first day. And I think part of it is that I really enjoy this idea of understanding in detail, listening to people in detail, and then being able to break down experiences to smaller components. And the ability that I have to do that also works well for people with intellectual disability, because for them, then I can do that when I'm communicating as well. But I think also it just captured my imagination at the time to realize that we have a culture that historically has often treated people with developmental disability and intellectual disability as kind of a collection of behaviors to be managed, or a visual experience to be avoided, or a set of problems to solve. And this was really my first time with this first client experiencing someone with intellectual disability as a human being.
So it's more focusing on the phenomenology, how the person experiences their world, their life, rather than how they're problematic for other people.
Yes. I mean, oftentimes I'm getting referrals for people who, because people's behavior is posing a problem for other people in their home or in their school or in their job. I mean, it's sort of like the way that lots of people get referred into therapy by third parties, right? This often happens.
You
like,
should see someone.
Yes, you should see someone so you can solve that problem that's creating a difficulty for me, right? So there's always this very fine balance for me with those clients of trying to help that third party referrer feel heard, but also know that I am not there to solve their problem. I am there to be with my client, to know my client, and to help them cope with their own feelings and their relationships and their own ideas about their disability and their experience of it, and be able to advocate for themselves and soothe themselves and find a life that's a little more meaningful. Now, that sounds very grand. I just want to point out, and oftentimes what I'm doing is much more limited than that, just because of the nature of funding and the infrastructure and what I can do. But that's the attitude with which I try to go into that work. And then doing that kind of work led me to an awareness of what adult disability, traumatic brain injury, things, people dealing with multiple sclerosis and muscular dystrophy and other health issues, and how that affects both thinking and emotionally just our, one's life. It's a very challenging way to live. And I also then had an experience of a parent with dementia personally, which sort of opened my eyes in that direction more. And I think one of the things that happens is when you get known for a certain population, for working with a certain kind of issue or population, people refer kind of adjacent stuff to you. So I became a therapist after an experience working in grief and loss work with people with life-threatening and terminal illnesses. But because I was doing this disability work, I started to get a lot of referrals for people with end-of-life issues. And then I started facing a lot of end-of-life issues in my own family and among my friends. So it sort of expanded out to a bigger, broader kind of category. And that, I would say that disability and illness-related work is probably about 50% of what I do.
I am aware that you do mindful self-compassion and ACT. I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit about the connections you see in between those two things, and then maybe how some of that applies in this kind of work that you do.
Yeah, definitely. I was introduced to both ACT and MSC around the same time by my colleague Robin Kirk back in, I think, 2013 or 2014, and attended a brief talk by Kristen Neff at a larger conference on compassion, and was really struck by it. But I was also really struck by ACT and chose to sort of do a deep dive there for a while. And I did a lot of training in ACT, and it really captured my attention, I think partly because of the values orientation. I felt like for the first time I was being given an approach to therapy that said, what matters to the person you're working with is more important than fixing their suffering. Not that we don't wish less suffering for people, but that the agenda to kind of control that is such a common part of, I think, the mental health field. We want to fix behavior, we want to fix feelings, we want to reduce stuff. And I think in ACT, there was this whole other dimension that was what we care about, what is really important to us is actually more important than all of this other stuff. And being given permission to focus on that in therapy was really liberating, I think.
Could you say that again? That's a very radical point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is, and I think it's been one of the sticking points for ACT within the larger mental health field. So it's this idea that in mental health, we're often trying to reduce symptoms. We're trying to help people change their behavior or help them feel less depressed or less anxious. And so the focus is on controlling the symptoms. And what ACT says is we may or may not be able to do that. But what about over here, the things that really make this person's life meaningful? What about what really drives their sense of what makes life worth living? Isn't it more important to focus on that? And here's the thing, there is an overlap. They're not exclusive.
So the agenda of emotional control, that becomes the agenda of the therapy.
Oh, absolutely.
Enterprise.
Yeah. And it's the agenda of insurance companies, and it's the agenda of some research, what was for a long time, to show that what we do as therapists changes the symptoms and the behaviors. It was not to measure, is this person's life worth living?
According to them and what they value.
Yes, exactly, Kate.
Putting agency back in the person.
Yes, exactly. So I spent quite a bit of time studying ACT, and then in 2018 decided to try studying a little more about MSC. And I'm not exactly sure why. I don't really remember what it was that tempted me back toward in that direction. But I went to a 2-day core skills training that Kristen Neff and Chris Germer put on, and came out of that kind of with my mind blown, that experience of what? Wait, there's this whole other piece that I hadn't really fully understood about how incredibly difficult it is to shift and change when we're doing it in this striving, self-critical, harsh, controlling kind of way. And that when we can offer ourselves compassion, it creates some looseness and some openness and some availability that I think is hard to get to otherwise. You all interviewed Leslie Huff recently, and she was talking about the dangers of self-improvement. I forget the full quote.
Subtle aggression.
The subtle aggression of self-improvement, one of my favorite lines. And without the self-compassion piece and without the mindful self-compassion piece, I think that is a potential even in ACT. It's like, oh, I should be defusing from my thoughts. Oh, I should be being more accepting. And, oh, I just need to find some committed action to take to move me towards my values, right? And I think that striving quality can really be there. And so for me, MSC softened all of that and also allowed me to find an overlap with my psychodynamic training.
What are the connections that you see there between any of the three that you mentioned, the psychodynamic, MSC, and ACT? Or it sounds like you're saying MSC helped to kind of soften the striving quality that sometimes people can approach ACT with. Was there any other connection that you saw there? So I feel like sometimes self-compassion is a kind of a way of diffusing in a way. It's like a quality of that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, is that the moment we can be kinder with ourselves, the easier it is to imagine that we might have other thoughts or have a different relationship to a situation in a different context, or that someone else might have a different perspective on it. But I have a personal experience with this that for me kind of, I think, encapsulates it somewhat. So I live in a rural community in Northern California on the beautiful, wild, and scenic Yuba River. And I live at the top of the river canyon. And the road that I'm off of becomes a gravel road as it goes down to the river and crosses the river. And so it's a rough road, hard to cross, not easy access, but a very, very popular swimming hole. And that particular river crossing became part of the state park system several years ago. And when that happened, the volume of people showing up just grew exponentially. And so I started having this experience of going down to have my swim at my favorite swimming hole and have this beautiful, peaceful experience, and seeing all these people parked in dangerous ways, blocking, emergency access, blocking the bridge, blocking other cars from getting through. And I would get so worked up. And my poor family and friends, because we would go together, and all I would do is sit there and complain and accuse and be, very frustrated with these drivers, and then ruin the time for everybody, right? And everyone would want to have this sweet swimming hole time, and I'd be still fuming about how these people had parked so unsafely, And then there was a moment when I realized I can't continue this way. I can't continue ruining it for everyone else, ruining it for myself, and sort of living with this amount of anger. And I thought at the time, oh, my job is to just not be angry and upset about this, right? I just need to change that. But somewhere I found the wisdom to stop for a moment and say, what's underneath all this? Like, why does this make me so angry? And I realized it's because I was scared. I was really scared that there was going to be a fire. I live in wildfire country in California. And a fire in the river canyon goes straight to my house, right?
Yeah.
And so I started to have a lot of respect for the underlying feeling that was causing the anger, the core emotion there. And to really demonstrate internally some attention to that, some awareness of it, and some kindness towards myself for, of course you're scared. That's a reasonable thing to be scared about. And of course, you want everyone else to be safe too. And that's kind of a value I hold, is like living in community with people and having compassion for each other's well-being. And that includes keeping each other safe. So when I got there, then I thought, well, what can I actually do in this situation? Where do I have any power? Because this fuming while I'm busy trying to relax and enjoy myself is not helping. It's not changing them. It's not helping me. Right? And that's where I could say, okay, well, if I could do something sort of values driven here. So there's the ACT piece. So I got softened, and then I could think about values. I created a little note, printed up a whole bunch of little notes that in a very friendly way said to people, welcome. So glad you're here to enjoy the river. Please be very careful about where you park. Don't park in any of the no parking areas, because fires and medical emergencies are common here, and we need first responders to be able to access. And then I just carried a stack of them. I still do every time I go to the river. And every time I see a car parked unsafely, I just tuck it under the windshield wiper. And for me, it was a moment where I could say, oh, there's a way to hold all of this. There's enough space here inside me to hold all of this, to hold the fear and the anger and the desire for safety and the desire to help and have some kind of empowerment and impact. But I wouldn't have gotten there without the self-compassion piece. And then I wouldn't have been able to find a solution without the ACT piece.
Very powerful example.
Feels like such a little thing in some ways, but for me, it was really big.
And writ large, it's a very big thing. I was realizing that in the psychotherapeutic relationships I've been in on both sides, how the agenda of emotional control interferes with the process hugely, because the therapist has their own agenda.
The truth is, I can talk very nobly about how I'm trying not to do that, but I do that every day. And this is, I think, another piece of MSC that has helped me enormously as a therapist, and really part of why I consider myself a self-compassion informed therapist. It's less about what I do with my clients and more about how I learn how to hold myself, because my control agenda shows up all the time in several sessions a day. And so part of my job is to notice that and to be able to soothe and support myself enough that I can back off and open and find some other ways of being with my client.
I imagine the relationship between therapist and client becomes a battle of the agendas of emotional control, which I suspect also becomes an issue in a lot of relationships of all sorts, family relationships, couple relationships, is battling agendas of emotional control.
Absolutely. I know as a client, I can speak about myself as a client, that I oftentimes will approach my therapist as if I'm asking for advice. Please fix me. Please tell me what to do. And then she will. And I'll be like, no, that's not what I need. Right. So that's also a dynamic that happens. But yes, I think clients, me included, we want to feel better.
I came across this term in reevaluation counseling, relaxed high expectations.
I love that.
Yes. And when I can sense it from someone, there's such a empowerment. I trust that you will figure this out, as opposed to, you're not figuring it out. What are we going to do about this? Let's tighten the screws. The panic of the therapist almost.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lovely phrase. What I hadn't really thought about until now is a tension, but I think it is a tension between the idea of aspiring for something better, higher, clearer, richer, more meaningful, nobler, and the idea of striving. There's a fine tightrope you have to walk between those two. Because I think that some of Buddhist psychology says if we aspire to values that are lower than what we're capable of aspiring to, we cause ourselves more suffering. And I think that's true with ACT as well, is that if we live a life that's focused on things other than valued, meaningful living, we create more suffering for ourselves. And yet we don't want to be approaching it as you said, sort of the screws tightening, this very rigid set of high expectations. I would also say that with my clients, part of what I'm doing is paying very close attention to the language that they use. I had a very early passion for reading fiction, drama, poetry. That was my thing. I was an English major, took no psychology classes in college at all. So I was in a completely different direction. But my favorite part of that work was in reading modern poetry is doing what's called a close reading, right? Which is really where you are kind of analyzing the language and the structure of the poem very closely and minutely to understand kind of how it operates, not in an objective sense. I'm not so much interested in poetry, in analyzing poetry from someone else's standard, but more for how it operates inside me. So then when I got to working as a therapist, I started to realize, oh, I'm doing the same thing. This is the same process. And in doing that, part of what I'm attending to is language that has a control agenda. And I'm listening for meaning and value. And I'm listening for metaphors that are valuable to the client, workable for them.
And when you notice those things, how do you respond to them, or how does that inform your thinking?
Well, this is where I think the psychodynamic work comes in, is that I was really taught for many years. I was in a training consultation program with a woman named Sandra Dussault, who's one of my heroes and mentors. And what I really learned from her, covering a wide variety of psychodynamic theories, was how to be relational. So when I'm listening for language, part of what I want to do is then bring it into the relationship in the room. So a lot of that is things like asking clients, oh, I noticed that you used this word. What does that word mean for you? Or, oh, I think I just heard you describing that feeling as being like a giant red ball. Wow, could we talk about that giant red ball and kind of imagine what it's doing, and what you would like it to do, and what happens when you push it this way, and what happens, can you deflate it, or do you want to blow it up? So we take the metaphor, we take the language, we try to expand and amplify on it. But we're trying to do it in a relational kind of way in the moment, where this is about something happening between us that we're playing with together, we're experimenting with together, which I think also keeps it more experiential, which I think is really helpful.
I don't know if you're familiar with narrative medicine, but it's an approach to training healthcare providers where they teach them how to do close reading with art and writing, and with exactly what you're describing in mind, that it helps the clinical encounter to develop those skills.
Yeah, I think narrative medicine, narrative therapy, poetry therapy all have some overlapping kind of beautiful tools.
I mean, it reminds me of exegesis, like looking at a biblical passage and why did they use that verb? Why is it in that tense? But also you're talking about a relationality in unpacking.
It isn't my job, or it isn't just my job, to sit and tell the client what it means. It's my job to discover it with them. And so what I'm doing is trying to tell them what I'm resonating with, what I notice, what kind of reverie is producing for me, and then to ask them to experiment with that, to ask them in the room with me to not just unpack, but to play with it, really.
So you're discovering it together. You're sort of walking together down this path, as opposed to, oh, let me tell you what it's all about.
Yes.
I understand you do some work with grief and loss as well. I wonder if you could share with us a bit about that.
Sure. When I first thought I might become a therapist, I did some volunteer work in California with people with life-threatening and terminal illnesses, and just emotional support work, very basic, and through an organization called the Center for Attitudinal Healing. And then I really stepped away from that kind of work and didn't do it for a long time. But because of the clientele that I was working with, I'm often experiencing client death or clients with a family member dying, because some disabilities are life-threatening. And I started to just have more and more experiences of that, including a case where I was very, very involved in the dying process. And then maybe 6 months after that happened, I started a period of about 12 years where I had multiple family members and close friends die. And my husband and I were doing caregiving and estate work off and on for quite a long time. So we started just coming up against the experience of death and loss over and over again, and the experience of grief. And I initially had a very strong control agenda about all of this. Like, well, I'm going to face this, and I'm going to do all my advanced directive planning, and I'm going to, and I'm going to make sure everybody else does. I started supplying my office with a box of advanced directive forms to give people who didn't have their advanced directives filled out, because I was so gung-ho about, everybody needs to take charge of this. But over time, of course, started to really have to softened to the idea that loss and separation are part of life. They're part of being human. And this was something one of my early therapists tried to tell me, and I didn't get it at all. And then years later, it's like, oh, she's right. All meeting ends in separation, doesn't it? It always does. And so I got more comfortable with being with grief and more comfortable with talking about the pain of being ill, the emotional and physical pain of being ill, and more comfortable with being with people when they know someone they love is going to die or when they know they are going to die. And just really interested in being open to what they need in the moment, which is hard because we want to control things and make people more comfortable and help them through. But oftentimes I've found that when I approach it that way, it backfires. And what's really needed is for me to stay open and curious.
How do you go about doing that? I feel like a lot of people, when they encounter grief, like if they have a friend or family member grieving or something like that, that they very quickly offer some kind of pat on the head or, words that are like attempting to be compassionate, but are landing very badly or like are really misguided. And it seems really about like getting it off their plate a little bit more than true, deep compassion. Like, I'm not comfortable with this. Let me say something quasi kind, and then can we move on, please?
Yeah.
I don't know. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about how you cultivate that ability to sort of be with that or yeah, because I feel like the world needs more people who have that capacity.
Well, so interestingly, one of the last deaths in that cycle was my mother-in-law, who was really, sorry, I'll apologize if I get tearful talking about this, but was one of the deeply loved people in my family, my husband's family, lived to 103. And I took the MSc Core Skills class 3 weeks later, I think. So the timing was such that I walked right into this environment where I was being asked to slow down, number one, and to attend to my own pain, and to do that in a balanced way that also allowed me to offer compassion to others. And I think that that's been an experience I've carried with me, is that when people are grieving, we are going to say the wrong thing. We are going to do it badly because it's painful. It's painful for us to witness somebody else grieving. And so if we can back up a little bit when we mess up, because we're going to, and slow down and listen not in an attempt to take it all on, but listen in an attempt to make a safe space for that person to feel whatever it is they're feeling, and to not be okay if they're not okay, for as long as they need to not be okay.
I think that requires a certain toolbox of capacity to be with our own discomfort and our own suffering so that we can create that space for other people.
Yeah, and that's where I feel like mindful self-compassion is, for me personally, been so rich and rewarding, is because in any situation where I find that I'm struggling, I now feel like I have tools I can use to help myself be present with whatever that internal pain is so that I can be more available to other people. It's not magic. It doesn't work all the time, not perfect, but it's a tool, and it's a really useful tool.
Knowing about opening and closing and mindful self-compassion, as a therapist sitting with clients, I can imagine that can be quite challenging, some of the stuff that it brings up for the therapist. And I suppose there's some extra labor there.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've had this experience, Alex, but I've definitely had experiences with colleagues where you tell them what your specialty is, and they're like, oh, I could never do that. That sounds so hard. And then they tell you their specialty, and you think, oh, I could never do that. That sounds so hard. So, I find that there are other experiences that I would have much less skill with. Domestic violence, addiction are two that I really have a hard time being around. I find them very activating. Not that because they're bad or any moral thing, but I just don't have the capacity. But for whatever reason, I've been allowed to learn how to be with grief and loss.
It sounds very rich and sort of charnel ground type stuff where you get to face and come to terms with things that we typically avoid. I had an internship involving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and it was a wonderful place. But I became aware of how, as a culture, all the judgments and all the disrespect, I think, people with developmental disabilities absorb. Society makes it much worse than it almost needs to be. So that was quite painful, seeing their suffering as humans.
We have a pretty dark and tragic history in terms of the way that we have treated people with developmental and intellectual disabilities in this country, and probably in other countries as well. I think it's also important to note that people with developmental and intellectual disabilities are at a much higher rate of risk for abuse because they're often conditioned to compliance.
All sorts of abuse, also sexual abuse, financial abuse.
Financial exploitation,
physical
bullying, all of that, So I just want to give a shout out to two organizations that have really both helped me and I think helped other people with some of their thinking. One is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So for autistic people, I think it just provides a really good sort of policy and advocacy perspective that's really needed. And another one is NAD, which is the National Association for the Dually Diagnosed, which focuses on people with developmental and intellectual disabilities who also have mental health issues. And that's really where I got my best training, is from them. And I think a large part of it was such a pleasure to show up to conferences there and be around other professionals who saw our clients as human beings and clearly had a great love for and respect for our clients.
And also, I have awareness of the high prevalence of disability and chronic pain that people carry around, and nobody can tell from the outside. So many people are affected so dramatically by these things, and I think they deserve to be addressed more directly by society.
Yeah, I think probably the general public doesn't really understand the deep connection between chronic pain and mood and behavior, how much of what we see in people's behavior or their affect presentation is related to chronic pain. But I also think there are various types of pain. And one example would be I work with people with seizure disorders. And when I'm working with somebody, an adult or a child who's just got frequent repeated seizures, and I think about not just the physical discomfort of that, but the trauma of it over and over and over and over again, that no one is intentionally inflicting on them. But it starts to make a lot more sense of their behavior to me when I look at it from a trauma lens. So I think pain and trauma are pieces of disability that we, as a culture, minimize. I think professionally, we're starting to understand that more.
And the links between trauma bringing on disability and chronic pain.
Well, and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities often live in kind of a web, an internet-connected web of support. They have social workers and doctors, and they may live in care homes or have independent living support. And not everybody, but many people. And that means that they are vulnerable not only to abuse, but to abandonment, to repeated transitions, to underfunding, just a series of larger structural issues that as an individual therapist, I don't have much power over, but it really benefits my clients for me to be aware of that and to be able to notice that with them, what that's like, and validate it. I feel like I want to uplift us with a different topic. This is sort of maybe the last thing that I was hoping to talk about, and that is the general concept of don't postpone joy. There was a bumper sticker at one point that said don't postpone joy on it, and I bought a whole bunch of them and gave it away to a whole bunch of my friends so that we were all driving around with don't postpone joy on our bumpers. And part of the reason was because I'd had some experiences as a teenager of kind of like awe and wonder, and then I spent a lot of time sort of chasing them, trying to figure out like what's the perfect arrangement of romantic interest, housing, job, schooling that's going to create that for me again? What's the location I can go to where I'm going to feel that again? And then when I met my husband, I discovered through him that it didn't really matter how difficult or messy or kind of incorrect all the circumstances were, that there was always like one moment when we could be together and feel joyful about something, We would go on walks together, and he's the best saver I know. So we'll go on walks and it's like, oh, look at this. Oh, look at that. Oh, isn't that an interesting doorway? And so I really got to cultivate this part of myself that says, don't wait till the moment when everything is right, when there isn't the trauma or isn't the abuse or isn't just daily life difficulty, or when we're not so busy, to just stop and say, yeah, that's awesome right there.
And that very much ties in with positive neuroplasticity ideas of how taking in the good over time can develop a sunny disposition, or the way we approach things and the meanings that memories have for us can shift through association with the good.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Rick Hanson's, and I love that whole concept. And yet for me, this is much less ambitious than that. It's just like, okay, life is going to be hard. That's a given. It's going to have these messy pieces in it. Why not just have moments of joy? Like, why wait?
You get the immediate benefit when you do it, right? Like, yeah, maybe you're also rewiring your brain in some beneficial way in the long term, but it just makes for a richer day, like a more fulfilled existence in the moment and in the day. I feel like, to engage with the world in that way.
Yes.
And switching out of rumination too, I suppose, so we don't dig the groove deeper and notice what is good.
Even if it's only for a moment, Alex, like for me, I often tell clients things like, you only need to do this for 5 seconds. That's all. And then if you want to go back to ruminating, do that. That's fine.
Right, totally.
You're free.
Yeah. Just don't deny yourself those 5 seconds.
Well, this has been lovely and mind-boggling. How can people learn more about you, your work, and things you're passionate about?
Well, so in about a month, there will be a website called judithhillweld.com. But for right now, I have a listing on Psychology Today, and that's the easiest way to find me and get hold of me.
Great. Thank you, Judith. We'll put links to that on our show notes page for you.
Thank you.
Pleasure chatting. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoy your podcast and enjoyed being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.